A quiet night at a roadside diner turned into a real nightmare. A biker humiliated a waitress in front of everyone, but he didn't know that Ronda Rousey was sitting at the next table. What happened next changed everything. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and write in the comments where you are watching this video. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a sea of blackness broken only by the occasional glint of lightning far off on the horizon. The two-lane highway cut straight through it like a scar, its cracked asphalt glistening faintly under the dim, intermittent flashes of the storm rolling somewhere out in the distance. There was no other sound except the low hum of wind rushing across the barren land and the muted growl of engines that might or might not have been real. In the heart of that emptiness, standing stubbornly against the years of dust, wind, and rain, was a diner whose neon sign buzzed and flickered as though struggling to keep alive. Cactus Star Diner, it read, though half the letters were failing and the rest sputtered uncertainly, casting more shadow than light. It was a building that had seen thousands of nights just like this one. Nights when travelers stumbled in, soaked by rain or scorched by heat, just to find coffee, pie, and a seat where the road couldn't reach them for a few minutes. Inside, the air was warm, thick with the scent of fried food, burnt coffee, and the faint tang of old grease that no amount of scrubbing could ever quite erase. The diner's linoleum floors had dulled from decades of boots. The counter bore the faint grooves of elbows leaned too heavily, and the booths sagged with the weight of countless forgotten conversations. A jukebox stood in the corner, its glass surface scratched and dulled, softly playing a faint tune that drifted in and out of static like a ghost whisper. Behind the counter, a young woman moved with the habitual weariness of someone who had worked more nights than days. Her name tag read Angela, though her friends simply called her Angie. She was no older than 25, with tired eyes and a quiet manner that came from being forced too often to smile when she didn't want to. Her apron was clean but faded, her shoes scuffed, her hair pulled back hastily. She tried to hold herself upright, but the weariness of the night pressed against her shoulders. She moved from counter to booth, coffee pot in hand, refilling cups that no one had asked to be refilled. She had learned long ago that in places like this, silence filled itself, and small acts of service were easier than words. The only customers at this late hour were the usual sort. A middle-aged trucker hunched over a plate of pie, his eyelids half shut, as though the sugar was the only thing keeping him awake for the miles ahead. A retired couple sat together in one of the corner booths, their hands resting close, though they spoke in murmurs so low they might have been speaking only to themselves. Outside, the rain began to tick against the glass, soft at first, then heavier, until it drowned out the jukebox's faint tune. The storm had arrived, cloaking the diner in an even deeper isolation. And then the door opened, the bell jingling softly, and Ronda Rousey stepped inside. She pushed her hood back, brushing a strand of damp blonde hair from her face, and surveyed the room with calm, sharp eyes. There was nothing extraordinary in her arrival, nothing dramatic or showy, but something about the way she carried herself marked her as different. She was dressed plainly, worn jeans, a dark jacket, sturdy boots. A duffel bag hung from her shoulder, the kind of bag carried by people who lived more on the road than at home. She paused for a moment just inside, letting the warmth wash over her, then moved toward the booth by the window. Angela glanced at her, offered the automatic tired smile, and made her way over. "Coffee?" she asked. Ronda gave a small nod, her voice low and steady when she spoke. "Black." She glanced briefly at the menu but didn't seem to need it. "And a burger? No onions." Angela wrote it down without comment and moved back toward the kitchen window, sliding the order through. Ronda sat back, her eyes drifting toward the window where rain streaked the glass in jagged lines. Each flash of lightning illuminated the wet pavement outside, the neon sign flickering as if it too were fighting against the storm. She didn't fidget, didn't pull out a phone, or look around nervously like other travelers might. Instead, she sat still, her gaze calm, her posture relaxed but grounded. She seemed like someone who could sit in silence for hours without needing to fill it with anything. The trucker lifted his head briefly, squinting at her as though recognizing her from somewhere, then shrugged and returned to his pie. The elderly couple spared her a polite glance before continuing their quiet conversation. For them, she was just another traveler, another stranger passing through. For Angela, though, there was something about this woman that drew her attention. Maybe it was the way she didn't seem restless. Maybe it was the sense of control in the way she moved, deliberate and measured. Whatever it was, Angela found herself glancing at her more often than she realized, as though expecting her to reveal something hidden. The minutes passed quietly. Coffee steamed in cups. The jukebox faded into another crackling blues track, and the storm deepened outside, thunder rattling faintly against the window panes. Rhonda's meal arrived, simple and steaming, and she ate with the same deliberate calm with which she had entered. She wasn't in a hurry. She wasn't watching the clock. She was simply present, grounded in a way that felt rare in a place where most people only stopped because they were desperate to keep moving. Angela returned to the counter, wiping at the surface though it was already spotless. She glanced at the clock more than once, her movements betraying a nervousness she tried to hide. Something in the way her eyes flicked toward the door told of worry, though no one else seemed to notice. Rhonda did. She saw the slight tension in the young woman's shoulders, the way she kept her rag moving across the counter as though afraid of stopping. It was the kind of nervous energy that revealed itself to trained eyes, to someone who had spent a lifetime reading the smallest shifts in body language. Rhonda didn't ask, not yet. She simply took another sip of her coffee, her gaze lingering on Angela just long enough to make her shift uneasily under the weight of it. Then she returned to her meal, silent, letting the storm press against the diner walls like a living thing. The night dragged on with the heavy patience of the desert. Outside, the rain fell harder, the neon light flickered lower, and the wind howled against the door. Inside, the diner seemed suspended in time, each figure locked in their own private world. The trucker's head dipped lower. The couple whispered more softly. Angela wiped the counter until her knuckles whitened, and Rhonda sat in her booth, calm, steady, unshaken. What no one knew yet was that this fragile quiet would not last. The storm outside was only a reflection of the one drawing closer on the road, its engines hungry and its riders cruel. For now, though, the Cactus Star Diner held its fragile peace, a pocket of light against the endless dark. And in that booth by the window sat a woman who carried storms of her own, storms she had learned not only to endure, but to command. The clock above the counter ticked past midnight, its steady rhythm lost beneath the roar of thunder. Angela poured herself a cup of coffee, her hands trembling faintly as she lifted it to her lips. She glanced once more at the door, the weight of some unspoken dread heavy in her eyes. Rhonda watched, silent, a quiet sentinel who had not yet been called to act. And outside, somewhere beyond the reach of the neon's dying glow, the sound of engines began to grow. The engines outside were still far away, low growls carried by the storm, but they faded again, blending with thunder until they became nothing more than echoes in the desert night. For a moment, the diner returned to its silence, the rain pelting against the windows, the hum of the jukebox fighting to be heard over the storm. Yet the fragile calm that lingered inside felt thinner now, as though every sound carried more weight than before. Angela's eyes flicked to the door once, twice, her lips pressing into a tight line, as if she was bracing herself for something inevitable. Rhonda noticed, though she kept her expression as calm as it had been since she entered. She had learned long ago to read tension, to see the way shoulders stiffened, hands shook, or eyes darted toward exits. She recognized it in the young waitress now, in the way she moved more quickly between tables, in how her rag wiped the same spot on the counter over and over again until the surface gleamed. Something was eating at her, something deeper than a storm outside. The trucker finally shifted in his seat, setting down his fork with a sigh. He glanced at the clock, rubbed at his tired eyes, and muttered something under his breath about the miles he still had left to go. His pie remained half-eaten. The elderly couple in the corner had grown quieter still, their coffee untouched, their hands resting on the table as though they were waiting out the storm more than enjoying the food. The silence pressed down on all of them, but it was Angela who seemed most aware of it. The door opened again, this time with the faint jingle of the bell that felt sharper than it should have been. It wasn't the storm forcing it open, but the push of a hand. 3 men entered, their laughter cutting into the fragile peace like knives. They weren't strangers here. They carried themselves with the arrogance of men who had walked through this diner many times before and never been told no. Their clothes were casual but dirty, the smell of cheap whiskey trailing after them, their eyes red from drink and smoke. "Cold one out there?" one of them said, shaking droplets of rain from his jacket as he scanned the room. His gaze lingered on Angela before he grinned at his companions. The others laughed as if at some private joke. Angela stiffened, her knuckles white around the coffee pot she held. She didn't say anything, just forced a smile and nodded. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice tighter than before. "Coffee, sure," one of them said, dragging out the word as though savoring it. "But only if you pour it yourself, sweetheart." The way he leaned across the counter made the trucker shift uncomfortably in his seat, though he kept his eyes down. The couple in the booth lowered their heads further, hoping not to draw attention. The jukebox's faint music seemed to falter, crackling with static as though even it knew something was wrong. Angela moved to pour the coffee, her hands shaking slightly. One of the men chuckled, leaning in closer, his voice dropping to something that was meant only for her, but loud enough that everyone could hear. "Steady there, darling. Don't spill it. Wouldn't want to make a mess." His friend laughed loudly, slapping the counter. The sound was jarring against the low hum of the storm. Angela tried to keep her expression neutral, tried to swallow the sting of the words, but the heat rose in her cheeks. Rhonda had been watching quietly from her booth, her burger long since finished, her coffee cooling beside her. She had not spoken, not moved more than to lift her cup, but now her eyes lifted, steady and unflinching. She studied the men for a moment, then set her cup down with deliberate calm. "Let her be," she said, her voice low, firm, carrying across the diner without the need to rise. The man at the counter turned, his grin widening as though he had just discovered a new game. "Well now," he drawled, "didn't know the waitress had herself a bodyguard." His companions laughed again, but the sound was nervous under the surface. There was something in the stillness of the woman who had spoken, something that didn't match the easy arrogance they had grown used to. Rhonda didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her eyes were steady, her body relaxed but grounded, her presence filling the space more than her words ever could. The man pushed himself upright and took a step toward her booth. "What's it to you, huh? We're just talking, having a little fun. Don't tell me you're the kind of girl who doesn't know how to laugh." Rhonda's gaze never wavered. "I said let her be." The silence that followed pressed hard against the walls. The trucker set his fork down again, his hands tightening into fists on the table. The couple in the corner clasped their hands together, whispering prayers no one could hear. Angela stood frozen behind the counter, her breath caught in her chest, her eyes darting between the men and the woman in the booth. The man laughed suddenly, too loud, the sound echoing in the small space. He looked back at his friends, shaking his head. "You hear that? She's serious. Wants to play hero." "Bunny," he leaned over Rhonda's booth, planting his hands on the table, bringing his face closer to hers. He smelled of alcohol and sweat, his grin sharp and mocking. "You gonna stop us, lady?" he asked, his voice low, daring. For a long moment, Rhonda didn't move. Her hands remained on the table, calm, steady. Then she spoke, her tone so even it sent a ripple of unease through the room. "Sit down, or you're going to regret it." The grin faltered, just for a second. He opened his mouth to reply, but one of his friends called out, breaking the moment. "Hey, leave her. She's not worth it. Let's just get the coffee and go." But the man at Rhonda's table wasn't ready to back down. His pride was caught in the weight of her stare, in the calmness that made his own bravado feel cheap. He straightened, forcing a laugh again, and turned back to Angela. "Coffee then," he said, his voice sharper now. He reached out suddenly, catching her wrist as she tried to pull away. Angela gasped softly, the pot in her other hand shaking dangerously. Her eyes filled with panic, her breath coming quick and shallow. The moment stretched taut, every eye in the diner locked on the man's hand gripping her wrist, on the fear that spilled across her face. And in that stillness, Rhonda's chair shifted. She rose from her seat without hurry, without flourish, but with the inevitability of someone who had already decided what came next. The man looked back at her, his grip tightening as if to prove his dominance. "Stay out of it," he snarled. But Rhonda only stepped closer, her presence like the rumble of thunder rolling over the desert. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't move fast. She simply spoke, her words a weight heavier than any fist. "Let her go." Outside, the storm cracked with a flash of lightning, illuminating the wet asphalt, the neon signs sputtering against the night. Inside, the air was so thick with tension it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Angela's eyes darted to Rhonda, a flicker of desperate hope shining through the fear. And in that moment, just before anything more could happen, the sound of engines roared again in the distance, louder this time, unmistakable, approaching fast. The diner froze, the storm outside echoing the storm that was about to break inside. The sound of the engines came again, louder now, too close to be mistaken for thunder. It rolled through the night like a pack of predators, deep, guttural roars that rattled the diner windows and seemed to shake the floorboards. Everyone inside felt it, that sudden shift in the air, the way the storm outside seemed to fade beneath the weight of something more immediate, more dangerous. Angela froze behind the counter, her hands still trapped in the man's grip, her eyes wide with a fear that had been hiding all night but could no longer be disguised. The trucker straightened in his seat, his fork clattering against the plate as he looked toward the door. The elderly couple shrank further into their booth, their hands gripping one another as if touch alone could shield them. The three local men exchanged glances, and for the first time their mocking bravado faltered. The one gripping Angela's wrist sneered as though to mask his sudden unease. But his hand loosened just slightly. He knew that sound. They all did. It wasn't just any group of bikes. It was Doyle's crew. Rhonda's gaze slid toward the door, her face calm, her posture unchanged. She had stood before, storms that came in the shape of men rather than clouds. There was nothing hurried in her movement, no panic, only the slow grounding of someone who had already accepted what was about to come. She stepped closer to Angela, her eyes never leaving the door as she said evenly, "Let her go." This time the man obeyed, pulling his hand back as though burned. He muttered something under his breath, but his eyes darted nervously toward the windows. The engines grew deafening as they neared, then abruptly cut. For a moment, the silence was worse than the roar, pressing into every corner of the diner, like the pause before a blade fell. The bell above the door shrieked as the door burst inward, flung open by the storm and the force of boots behind it. They entered like they owned the night. 6 of them, maybe 7, the exact number difficult to count in the swirl of rain and movement. Leather jackets soaked from the downpour, boots stomping heavily against the linoleum, the smell of oil, sweat, and cigarette smoke rushing in with them. They shook the water from their hair and jackets as though they had stepped into their own clubhouse rather than a diner, their voices loud, their laughter sharp. The small space that had felt crowded even with a handful of customers now seemed suffocated beneath their presence. At their head was a man who carried himself with the confidence of someone long accustomed to fear. He was broad-shouldered, his leather jacket studded and scarred, a jagged line running from his jaw up to his ear that twisted every smirk into something cruel. A thick chain hung from his neck, gleaming faintly beneath the flickering lights. His eyes swept the diner with the arrogance of a predator surveying his hunting ground. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice loud enough to fill the space without effort. "Cactus Star still open for business. Thought the storm might have shut you down, Angie." His gaze found Angela instantly, locking onto her with a familiarity that sent a visible shiver down her spine. Angela swallowed hard, her lips parting soundlessly before she managed to speak. "You need to leave, Doyle," she said, her voice trembling but audible. "I told you before, I'm not paying." The room seemed to contract around those words. The trucker's eyes widened, his breath catching audibly. The elderly couple ducked lower in their booth, avoiding any hint of eye contact. Even the 3 local men who had been mocking Angela moments earlier shrank back, their faces pale as they tried to blend into the background. They might have been cruel in their own way, but they were cowards in the face of real violence. Doyle's smirk widened into something darker. He stepped forward, the floor creaking beneath his weight as he slapped a heavy hand against the counter. The silverware jumped, a fork clattering loudly onto the tiles. That's the problem, sweetheart, he said, his voice smooth but edged with menace. You think you've got a choice, but protection don't pay itself. You wouldn't want this nice little place to have an accident, would you? His breath smelled of beer and smoke, his presence looming like the storm itself. Angela tried to stand straighter, though every muscle screamed at her to tremble. Her jaw tightened, her fingers curling around the rag she still held as though it could anchor her. I said no. The word hung in the air like a fragile thing. Fragile, but defiant. Doyle's men reacted instantly, laughter echoing through the diner. One tall, lanky biker with uneven teeth picked up a salt shaker from the counter and tossed it casually, watching it smash against the wall near the jukebox. The sound was sharp, startling, making Angela flinch though she fought to keep her face composed. Another biker leaned across a booth, sneering at the elderly couple until they turned their faces toward the window, trembling. You hear that, boys? Doyle said, his grin flashing, though his eyes were dark. She thinks she's in charge. One of his men, emboldened, slid behind the counter, stepping too close to Angela. His boots squeaked on the wet floor, his grin wide as he reached for her wrist. She tried to step back, but the shelves of mugs stopped her. Her heart hammered, her chest rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. The trucker shifted in his seat, muttering under his breath. But he didn't move. Fear held him like it held everyone else. Everyone except one. From the booth by the window, Ronda rose. She didn't move quickly. She didn't shout. She simply stood, her chair sliding back with a faint scrape against the floor, and the diner seemed to still around her. Her eyes were fixed on Doyle, but her body shifted just enough to place herself between Angela and the man reaching for her. The biker sneered at her. What's this? You want to turn too? His hand shot out toward Angela, but before it could close around her wrist, Ronda's hand caught his. The grip was like iron, steady, immovable. The biker yelped in shock, trying to pull away, but her hold didn't budge. With a sharp twist and a shift of her weight, she redirected his arm into a joint lock that forced him to his knees. The sound of tendon and bone straining filled the diner, followed by the biker's groan as he collapsed onto the floor. The room froze. The rain hammered the windows. The jukebox hummed faintly. But inside, all eyes were locked on the woman now standing between Doyle and his men. Angela stared at her, breathless, her wrist red but free. Ronda didn't look back. Her gaze was fixed on Doyle. Her voice, low and steady, cut through the silence. She said no. Walk out now. For a heartbeat, disbelief flickered across Doyle's scarred face. Then he barked a laugh, sharp and humorless. He spread his arms wide, gesturing to the scene. You serious? You think you can walk into my business and tell me how to run it? This isn't your business, Ronda said calmly. Not tonight. The biker on the ground scrambled backward, clutching his twisted wrist, his eyes wide. The other men shifted uneasily, their bravado faltering in the face of a calmness that felt more dangerous than any threat. They had expected fear. They had expected pleading. Instead, they faced a woman who moved like a storm, but stood like a mountain. Doyle's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. Who the hell do you think you are? He demanded, his voice louder now, angrier. Ronda's gaze didn't waver. Her tone remained calm, steady, unshaken. Someone who doesn't tolerate men hurting women. For a long, heavy moment, the only sound was the storm pressing against the walls, the steady drum of rain on glass, the distant rumble of thunder. Angela's chest heaved, her pulse hammering in her ears. The trucker mouthed something, too stunned to say it aloud. The elderly couple clutched each other tighter, their fear mingled with something else, something like hope. Then, as though Doyle's pride couldn't withstand the weight of silence any longer, one of his men moved. The wiry biker with crooked teeth lunged forward with a shout, fists swinging wildly toward Ronda. And in that instant, the fragile balance of the night shattered. The moment the wiry biker launched himself at her, time seemed to stretch into sharp, fractured pieces. His fist cut through the air with drunken violence, wild and unrestrained. But Ronda's body moved with precision born from years of discipline. She stepped slightly to the side, her hand rising not to strike, but to redirect. The man's momentum carried him into her grasp, and with a twist of her hip, she seized his wrist and turned, pulling him forward and downward. The impact of his body against the counter echoed through the diner like a gunshot. Plates rattled, the trucker flinched, the elderly couple gasped in unison, and the jukebox's tune flickered with static as though even it had been jarred by the force. The wiry man crumpled, groaning, his face pressed against the cold linoleum. For a heartbeat, silence followed, shocked and heavy. Then Doyle roared, the sound part laughter, part outrage, filling the diner with his fury. "Get her!" he shouted, his voice cracking like a whip over his men. Two more lunged at once. One came low, aiming to tackle her around the waist, while the other swung a heavy chain that glinted under the flickering fluorescent light. The air seemed to crackle with violence, and yet Rhonda's expression remained unchanged, her eyes sharp and clear. She shifted her weight as the chain whipped toward her, ducking just enough to let it slice through empty air. Her hand shot out, catching the biker's wrist mid-swing, redirecting the momentum with a sharp pull. His own strength betrayed him, sending him stumbling forward. With a swift pivot, Rhonda slammed him against the edge of a booth. The wood cracked under the impact, the biker gasping in pain as he slid to the floor, clutching his shoulder. Even before he hit the ground, the second attacker was upon her. His arms wrapped around her waist in a desperate attempt to drag her down, his weight driving forward. But Rhonda was grounded like stone, her stance firm, her center balanced. She hooked one arm under his, lifted with the surge of his own momentum, and flipped him clean over her shoulder. The biker's body crashed into a table, shattering dishes and scattering mugs across the floor in a violent explosion of sound. Coffee splattered the walls and the elderly couple shrieked, ducking behind their booth as fragments of ceramic clattered around them. The trucker's eyes were wide now, his phone shaking in his hand as he raised it to record. His lips moved soundlessly before he whispered to himself, "You've got to be kidding me." The fight pressed on with relentless force. Another biker surged forward, his face twisted with rage, a switchblade flashing in his hand. The blade caught the light as he drove it toward Rhonda's side, the strike quick and mean, but her eyes never left him. Her hand clamped down on his wrist before the knife could reach her, twisting sharply until the man cried out. The knife clattered to the floor, spinning once before lying still. With a powerful strike of her palm against his chest, she sent him sprawling backward. His breath rushed out in a choking gasp as he hit the floor, his eyes wide with shock and fear. The diner had become chaos. Chairs screeched across the floor, the jukebox fizzled and sparked in protest, and the storm outside thundered louder as though in rhythm with the violence within. The trucker, trembling but determined, leaned back in his seat, his phone catching every brutal second. The elderly couple clung to each other, peeking from behind their booth with horrified eyes. Angela stood frozen behind the counter, her breath ragged, her knuckles white against the wood as she clutched it to keep herself steady. Through it all, Rhonda moved like water over stone. There was no wasted energy, no frantic strikes. Every block, every throw, every blow was calculated, efficient. She wasn't fighting with rage. She was dismantling them with precision, as if she had done it 1,000 times before. Doyle's sneer twisted as he watched his men fall one after another. His chest rose and fell heavily, his pride burning hotter than his anger. He pulled something from his jacket, holding it up for all to see as he slipped the metal over his fingers. Brass knuckles gleamed under the dying light. He stepped forward slowly, each boot pressing into the linoleum with deliberate menace. "All right, hero," he growled, his voice low but caring. "You've got some moves. Let's see how you handle a real fight." Rhonda adjusted her stance, her body angled, her hands loose but ready. She didn't respond with words, didn't rise to his taunt. Her silence was louder than any challenge, her composure enough to rattle even the man who had built his reputation on fear. Doyle lunged, jabbing for her ribs with the speed of a man who had spent years throwing punches. The metal gleamed just before impact, but Rhonda's forearm shot down, blocking the strike with a sharp, controlled motion. The blow glanced harmlessly aside, the vibration echoing up her arm but not breaking her focus. Doyle snarled and swung again, harder this time, aiming for her head. Rhonda shifted, her hands snapping up to trap his arm, twisting sharply and forcing his momentum down. With a swift movement, she drove her elbow into his back. The sound of his breath bursting from his lungs filled the room as his knees buckled beneath him. Still, Doyle was not finished. With a furious shout, he surged upward again, trying to tackle her in a desperate bid to reclaim control. His body crashed forward, heavy and relentless, but Ronda pivoted with calm grace. She hooked his arm, redirecting his weight with perfect timing, and executed a flawless throw. Doyle's body slammed into the floor with brutal force, his brass-knuckled fist clattering against the tiles as he groaned in pain. The silence that followed was thick, punctuated only by the storm outside, and the ragged breathing of men scattered across the diner floor. 4 of Doyle's crew lay groaning, clutching bruised limbs, their arrogance shattered as completely as the dishes around them. The wiry one who had first swung at her moaned softly, still crumpled against the counter. The man who had wielded the chain whimpered, his shoulder hanging limply. The one who had lunged with the knife lay on his back, gasping for air like a fish stranded on the shore. Doyle himself rolled onto his side, his chest heaving, his pride bleeding out alongside his strength. His eyes burned with fury, but behind it lurked the unmistakable shadow of fear. Angela's breath came in quick, uneven gasps, her chest rising and falling as though she had been the one fighting. Her eyes fixed on Ronda, wide and full of something between awe and relief. She clutched her wrist where the first man had grabbed her earlier, the skin still red, but her hand trembled less now. The trucker's phone was still raised, his hands shaking, his mouth hanging open. "This is unreal," he whispered, almost to himself, as though even saying it aloud might break the fragile reality of what he was witnessing. Ronda stood in the center of the wreckage, her breathing steady, her face calm. She didn't gloat. She didn't shout. She simply adjusted her jacket, her eyes scanning the room not with triumph, but with vigilance, making certain no threat remained. Her calm in the aftermath was more terrifying than Doyle's rage had ever been. "They won't bother you again," she said quietly, her voice carrying over the silence, settling into the bones of everyone who heard it. "Not tonight." Her words seemed to anchor the space, to fill the void that violence had left behind. For the first time in hours, Angela exhaled, her shoulders sagging under the weight of her relief. And then, piercing through the night, came the shriek of sirens. Red and blue lights flickered against the rain-streaked windows, painting the shattered diner in broken color. Tires screeched against wet asphalt, and the slam of car doors followed. The storm outside raged on, but inside the Cactus Star diner, another storm had broken. The wail of the sirens cut through the night, echoing across the rain-slick highway. But for those inside the diner, the danger was not finished. The flashing lights had not yet reached the building, and Doyle's men were still on their feet, driven by pride, rage, and the refusal to accept humiliation. The small space reeked of smoke, sweat, and the sour tang of spilled beer. The tables overturned, plates shattered, fragments crunching under heavy boots. The jukebox hissed, sparking faintly as though it too were wounded in the chaos. Ronda stood at the center of it all, her stance grounded, her eyes sharp and unyielding. She had already dismantled half the crew, but violence has a way of breeding desperation. Even beaten men will crawl for a scrap of dignity when pride is all they have left. Doyle groaned as he tried to rise, his breath coming in ragged bursts, his brass knuckles lying useless at his side. His gaze burned with hatred, but he couldn't summon the strength to get up again. "Don't just stand there," he barked at his remaining men, spittle flying from his lips. "Finish her!" His voice cracked with pain, but carried the command of a man who had never known how to back down. The order split the room like a lash. 2 bikers exchanged a glance, then surged forward, fueled by the desperate need to reclaim their leader's honor. One grabbed a broken chair leg, brandishing it like a club. The other swung a heavy glass ashtray he had snatched from a nearby table. Their boots pounded against the tiles as they charged, their curses filling the air. Ronda shifted smoothly, her body moving as if the chaos around her was merely a rhythm she could step into. The one with the ashtray swung wide, aiming for her head. She ducked low, the glass whooshing over her hair as she drove her shoulder into his chest. He stumbled back, winded, and before he could recover, her knee shot up, striking him in the sternum. The air whooshed out of his lungs as he collapsed backward, the ashtray slipping from his fingers and shattering on the floor. The second attacker brought the chair leg down with brutal force, but Rhonda's arm rose in a tight block. The wood cracked against her forearm, but she seized the weapon before he could raise it again. With a twist, she yanked it from his grip, spun it once in her hand, and drove the end into his gut. He doubled over with a grunt, and Rhonda brought the weapon down across his back, sending him sprawling over a booth, his breath knocked from him in a pained cry. The elderly couple cowered deeper into their booth, their hands clasped together in silent prayer. The trucker's phone trembled in his hand as he continued recording, his voice breaking in a whispered litany of disbelief. Unreal. It's just unreal. His wide eyes never left Rhonda, watching every movement as though he couldn't believe a human being could fight with such control, such precision. But the chaos was far from over. The youngest biker, wiry and pale with a cruel gleam in his eyes, had pulled himself upright again. His hand slipped into his jacket and, when it came out, a glint of steel caught the light. The switchblade clicked open with a snap that sliced through the air, sharp and final. He lunged with it, his face twisted into a mask of hatred. Angela gasped behind the counter, her hand flying to her mouth. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear the storm outside. She had seen knives before, had seen threats whispered and shouted, but never had she seen a blade gleam so close to the woman who stood protecting her. Time seemed to slow. The knife thrust forward, aiming for Rhonda's ribs. She moved with absolute calm, catching his wrist in midair. Her grip tightened like a vice, the blade halting inches from her side. The young man snarled, trying to press forward, but Rhonda twisted sharply, bending his wrist back until he cried out in agony. His hand opened, the knife clattering to the floor. Rhonda didn't hesitate. With her other hand, she struck his chest in a powerful palm thrust, sending him sprawling onto his back. He gasped for air, staring at the ceiling with wide, disbelieving eyes. The knife lay discarded beside him, harmless now, its menace neutralized. The storm raged against the diner walls, lightning flashing across the desert sky, thunder shaking the glass. Inside, the fight pressed on, the air thick with adrenaline and fear. Rhonda pivoted, her gaze sweeping the room, every muscle ready for the next strike. One of the larger bikers, his lips split and his eyes blazing with rage, charged from the side, grabbing a bottle from a table as he ran. He swung it in a wide arc, but Rhonda caught his wrist, the glass whistling past her ear. With a sharp yank, she pulled him forward and used his momentum to slam him into the counter. The bottle slipped from his grip and shattered, spraying shards across the floor. Rhonda pressed her forearm into his chest, pinning him for a moment before sending him sprawling to the ground with a final push. The diner was a battlefield now. The air was filled with the smell of broken wood, spilt coffee, and sweat. Plates were smashed underfoot, the counter littered with silverware scattered in the chaos. The jukebox had given up, its last note fading into silence, leaving only the storm and the sounds of bodies hitting the floor. Through it all, Doyle watched, his pride bleeding out of him as he struggled to lift himself to his knees. His eyes followed Rhonda's every move, his jaw clenched so tightly the scar on his face seemed to twitch. Hatred radiated from him, but there was something else beneath it, fear. He had built his life on being the biggest threat in the room, but here, now, he faced someone who stood against him without flinching, someone who turned his strength into weakness and his dominance into ruin. Angela's breath trembled as she gripped the counter, her knuckles white. For months she had lived with Doyle's threats, with his crew's laughter echoing in her nightmares. She had prayed for someone to stand up to them, but she had never truly believed it could happen. And yet here was this stranger, a woman who moved with a fighter's grace and a warrior's certainty, dismantling them one by one without hesitation. Hope flickered in Angela's chest, fragile but fierce. The last of the bikers tried one more desperate lunge, but his movements were sluggish, his breath ragged. Rhonda sidestepped easily, her arm shooting out to catch his shoulder. She spun him, slammed him against the wall, and pinned him there with one hand, her gaze cutting into him like steel. His fight drained out of him instantly, his eyes dropping to the floor as he muttered something incoherent, surrendering without words. The room fell still at last, the only sounds the groans of defeated men and the storm pressing against the glass. Rhonda released the last biker, letting him slump to the floor. She stepped back to the center of the diner, her chest rising and falling steadily, her calm intact. She scanned the room once more, her eyes settling on Doyle, who still crouched near the counter, his brass knuckles clutched weakly in his hand. Doyle tried to rise again, pushing against the floor with trembling arms, but his body betrayed him. He staggered, swayed, and finally collapsed back onto his knees. His eyes burned with fury as he spat words through gritted teeth. "This isn't over," he growled. "You hear me? This isn't over." Rhonda didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence that followed was answer enough, heavier than any threat. Her presence alone was a promise that Doyle's reign of intimidation had ended, at least for tonight. The trucker's phone shook as he lowered it, his breath uneven, his face pale. He looked from the screen to the woman standing amidst the wreckage, his voice trembling. The world needs to see this," he whispered. His hands fumbled, clutching the device as though it was proof of something greater than any words could capture. Angela exhaled shakily, tears welling in her eyes as she stepped forward from behind the counter. She opened her mouth to speak but found no words, her gratitude caught in the lump of her throat. Her wrist still ached where Doyle's man had grabbed her, but the fear that had lived in her bones for so long felt lighter now, as though the weight had been lifted. And then the sirens drew closer, the red and blue lights splashing across the rain-streaked windows, bathing the broken diner in fractured color. Doors slammed outside, voices shouted over the storm, and the heavy tread of boots approached. The storm outside roared on, but inside the Cactus Star diner, the fight was finished. Rhonda stood tall among the wreckage, her presence steady and unshaken, while Doyle and his crew lay scattered and broken around her. For the first time in a long while, the air inside the diner felt different. It no longer belonged to Doyle and his men. It belonged to those who had witnessed courage, to those who would carry the memory of this night long after the storm had passed. The flashing red and blue lights spilled through the rain-streaked windows, cutting across the diner's wreckage in harsh pulses that made everything inside look broken twice over. The overturned chairs cast jagged shadows, the shards of glass on the floor shimmered like scattered stars, and the groans of Doyle's crew rose and fell under the rhythm of the storm outside. The bell above the door rattled as it opened, and two officers stepped inside with weapons drawn, their boots squelching with rainwater as they swept their eyes across the scene. What they found was not the chaos of a brawl still raging, but the aftermath of something violent, precise, and already finished. Angela stood frozen behind the counter, her chest rising and falling as though she had run for miles. Her eyes darted from the officers to Rhonda, still standing tall near the center of the diner, her posture calm, her breathing steady, as if she had simply been waiting for this moment. Doyle lay slumped near the counter, one arm bent awkwardly against his side, his brass knuckles still clutched weakly in his hand. His lip was split, blood trickling down his chin, but his eyes still burned with a venom that no defeat could extinguish. Even beaten, he tried to hold himself like a man who had lost a fight, but not his power. The younger officer's eyes widened at the sight of the scene, his gun lowering slightly in disbelief. "What the hell happened here?" he muttered, his voice echoing against the broken silence. Angela found her own voice, though it trembled as it escaped her. "They came in. They tried to hurt me. They've been coming for months, and she—" Her eyes flicked toward Rhonda. She stopped them. The officer followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the woman who stood without flinching under his scrutiny. Recognition flickered briefly in his expression, but he said nothing. Instead, he gestured to his partner, who moved quickly to secure the bikers, pulling one groaning man to his feet and shoving him toward the door. Doyle snarled as hands grabbed him, his pride fighting even as his body failed him. "You think this ends with me?" he hissed, his voice low but sharp enough to slice through the air. His eyes locked on Angela as he was hauled upright, his weight sagging between the two officers. "You made a mistake tonight, girl. You'll regret this." Angela's stomach twisted, her breath catching in her throat. But before she could falter, Rhonda stepped forward. She didn't speak, not at first, but her gaze fixed on Doyle with the weight of unspoken steel. Her eyes were calm, steady, unyielding, and something in them silenced the gang leader mid-breath. His jaw snapped shut, the threat unfinished, his body trembling with rage as the officers shoved him toward the door. The storm howled louder as the bikers were dragged outside, their curses swallowed by the night. Rain lashed against their faces as they were shoved into waiting cruisers, their boots slipping on the slick asphalt. Doyle fought until the end, but even he could not mask the defeat that clung to him. His crew slumped in silence, their pride broken alongside their bodies. Inside, the diner exhaled as if the walls themselves had been holding their breath. Angela sagged against the counter, tears threatening to fall as her trembling hands finally loosened their grip on the wood. The elderly couple slowly straightened in their booth, their eyes still wide but their breaths less frantic. The trucker lowered his phone at last, his thumb hovering uncertainly over the screen, as though he didn't quite believe what he had captured. A third man entered the diner, older, his gray-streaked hair plastered to his forehead from the rain. He removed his hat and shook the water from it before stepping forward, his sharp eyes taking in the destruction with the weary gaze of someone who had seen too much of this kind of violence before. His name tag read Sergeant Ortega, and his voice carried both exhaustion and authority. "We've been after Doyle's crew for a long time," he said, looking between Angela and the wreckage. "Extortion, intimidation, assault. Every time we got close, witnesses clammed up. Fear kept everyone quiet. But tonight changes things." Angela's throat tightened as she tried to respond. Her voice wavered, but she forced the words out. "They came 3 times before. Threatened me. Demanded money. They broke a window once. I didn't report it because—" She hesitated, swallowing hard, her shame pressing against her chest. "Because I didn't think it would matter." Ortega's gaze softened, though his voice remained firm. "It matters now. You're making it matter." Behind him, the younger officer struggled to drag one of the injured bikers out the door, his boots squeaking on the wet tiles. Outside, the sirens dimmed, the cruiser's lights flashing silently as they swallowed the gang one by one. The rain hissed across the roof, softer now but relentless. The trucker finally found his voice, his hands still shaking as he clutched his phone. "I got it all," he said quickly, almost desperately. "From the moment they walked in until Doyle hit the floor. It's all here." His eyes flicked between Ortega and Rhonda, his expression both nervous and reverent. Ortega nodded and handed him a card. "Send it here. That video will make this airtight." Then his gaze returned to Angela. "You're pressing charges?" Angela straightened slowly, her fear still there, but layered now with something stronger. Her voice was steady when she answered. "Yes. Every single one of them." "Good," Ortega said, his tone carrying approval. "We'll keep a patrol car circling here for a while. But be careful. Doyle has friends, ugly ones. This isn't the end." Angela nodded, though her eyes flicked instinctively toward Rhonda. The fighter hadn't moved much since Doyle had been dragged away. She stood near the booth she had left, her presence unchanged, her calm unshaken. The denim of her jacket was barely creased from the fight, as if even violence couldn't cling to her. She hadn't celebrated her victory, hadn't demanded thanks. She simply remained steady and silent, as though she had been carved from the storm itself. Angela found herself stepping closer to her, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They'll come back, won't they?" Rhonda finally looked at her, her eyes steady, her tone even. "Maybe not them, but someone will." Angela's chest tightened. "So, what do I do?" Rhonda stepped nearer, her presence grounding, her voice carrying the weight of certainty. "You don't flinch next time." The words landed heavy, simple but undeniable. Angela's lips parted, her mind spinning, but slowly she nodded. Her hands trembled less than before. For the first time in months, she felt like the fear did not own her. The cruisers pulled away, their lights fading into the storm. Silence settled once more in the diner, broken only by the hiss of rain and the faint groans of furniture being lifted. Rhonda moved quietly without being asked, setting a chair upright, then another, restoring order piece by piece. Angela watched her, her throat tight, the truth of her words settling deep into her bones. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the desert sky bruised with gray clouds and streaks of sunlight pushing through. The neon sign outside flickered weakly, but still held its ground, casting its stubborn glow across the wet pavement. Inside, the diner smelled of coffee and damp earth, the wreckage stacked in a corner, the cracked window patched with tape. Angela hadn't slept, but she stood behind the counter with a steadiness she hadn't felt in a long time. Every sound of the diner opening again, the clink of dishes, the scrape of a chair carried new meaning. The fear was still there, but it no longer defined her. She poured coffee with hands that no longer shook. She greeted customers with a voice that no longer faltered. Rhonda sat in her booth, quiet as she had been before the fight. She had helped Angela clean through the early hours, lifting tables, sweeping shards, never saying more than she needed to. Now she sat with arms folded, a fresh cup of coffee before her, her presence unchanged, unshaken. Word had already begun to spread. Phones across Red Ridge buzzed with the video the trucker had uploaded. People had watched Doyle's men fall and had seen Angela stand her ground with a stranger at her side. Customers trickled in with cautious glances at the taped window, their whispers carrying the story like wildfire. A mother entered with her 2 children, their shoes squeaking on the wet tiles. One of the boys froze, pointing directly at Rhonda with wide eyes. "Mom, it's her!" he whispered too loudly, his voice trembling with awe. The mother hushed him quickly, guiding him toward a booth, avoiding Rhonda's gaze. But the boy kept staring, unable to look away from the woman who had turned fear into something else. Angela leaned against the counter, her eyes resting on Rhonda. She had questions, so many questions, but the words caught in her throat. Rhonda seemed both near and distant, as though she belonged here, and yet was already halfway gone. 2 plainclothes officers entered not long after, shaking rain from their coats. One introduced himself as Detective Serrano, his sharp eyes sweeping the room. He approached Angela, his voice steady but probing. "You're Maria Hill?" he asked, using her full name from the report. She nodded. He glanced around the diner, then back at her. "We've been tracking Doyle's crew for a long time. What happened here? It's blowing holes in their whole operation. They've been running protection rackets across the county, maybe further. You just tore down part of their wall." Angela's throat tightened, but she forced herself to speak. "So, it helps?" "It does more than help," Serrano replied. "They rule by fear. You stood against that. People saw it. That matters." His gaze slid toward Rhonda, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "And her?" Angela shook her head. "She doesn't want credit." Serrano raised an eyebrow but didn't press. He left her with a card, his last words heavy. "Be careful. Fear doesn't vanish overnight." Then he was gone, leaving Angela with the weight of his warning. When she returned to Rhonda's booth, the fighter had finished her eggs and toast, her plate pushed aside. Angela poured her another cup of coffee, setting it gently before her. "They say more might come," she said softly. "They will," Rhonda answered. "You're staying?" Angela asked, a thread of hope hidden in her voice. Rhonda shook her head. "No." Angela's stomach sank. "Why? After everything?" "This isn't about me," Rhonda said simply. "You don't beat men like Doyle by waiting for someone else to show up. You beat them by making sure they know they can't come back." Angela stared at her, struggling against the lump in her throat. "I don't know if I can do it alone." "You're not alone anymore," Rhonda replied. Her tone wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. It was certain, and that certainty planted itself inside Angela like a seed. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy with meaning, with finality. The diner hummed softly with voices and clinking mugs as life returned, piece by piece. Rhonda slid out of the booth, placing a few bills on the table, far more than enough to cover her meal. Angela followed her instinctively as she walked toward the door, her hands wringing against her apron. "Will I see you again?" she asked, her voice trembling. Rhonda paused at the door, the morning light spilling across her profile. She didn't turn fully, just enough to let her words settle in the space between them. "If they come back," she said, "you won't need me." And then she stepped out into the daylight, her figure dissolving into the horizon beyond the highway, her presence lingering like the storm that had passed. Angela stood in the doorway for a long time, watching her go. She didn't look back. The buzz of the diner grew steady behind her, voices rising, laughter sparking faintly. The jukebox, though broken, flickered once as if trying to come back to life. Angela turned at last, her breath steady, her hands strong, walking back behind the counter with a quiet resolve she had never known before. Fear no longer chained her. For the first time in months, she felt free. Not because Rhonda had stayed, but because she had shown her that she didn't have to break. The Cactus Star Diner still bore scars, but it was alive. So was she. And sometimes it only takes one person to wake an entire town. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss what's coming next. Check out our other unbelievable stories waiting for you right now, each one more shocking than the last. And share this video with your friends so they can see the twist nobody saw coming.